Give us an example of what shocked you that you discovered during that reporting.
So one of the things was that Twitter, heading into the 2020 election, had worked out a system with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, whereby they had what they called an industry meeting, where once it started off once a month, then it was once a week, where these intelligence officials were meeting with Twitter and about 24 other internet platforms and briefing them on things that they might expect in the information landscape. And then there was a system by which basically Twitter was receiving recommendations about content from the federal government through the FBI, and then from the states through the Department of Homeland Security. It was that organized. They had worked it out that, like, if it comes from, a local police department, it's going to come from the DHS. If it comes from the HHS, it's going to come through the FBI, right? So they had a very organized system of flags that where you would see the FBI say, for your consideration, here are some accounts that may violate your terms of service. And there'd be an attached spreadsheet with, 400 account names on it. And that was just happening constantly. It was an industrial process that they had worked out. I thought that's a huge story, right? Here's the FBI that's devoting resources to looking at social media accounts of ordinary people and worrying about terms of service violations. Like, what is that? Why are they not looking for child predators and stuff like that? Right?
And so what was that?
Well, it's part of this sort of sprawling thing where a whole series of government agencies are very intensely interested in what's online and who's reading what, and in developing new ways of, suppressing content, de-amplifying other things. And with COVID, there was a really, really intense effort to create rules about what could and could not be seen. They would decide that things were. One of the key concepts that I thought was really, really disturbing was this whole idea that anything that promotes vaccine hesitancy is a kind of disinformation, even if it's not factually incorrect. So if somebody dies after they get the shot, right, that may be true, but internally at the company,
but knowing that might convince other people not to take the shot.
Exactly. And so they looked at that as a kind of disinformation, even though it's true.
Disinformation doesn't mean untrue, correct?
Exactly. It carries the connotation, like the definition involves falsity, right? Or misinformation even, right? So disinformation is like the intentional spreading of lies, right? But even misinformation, the Homeland Security has something they called the MDM, or they had it, the MDM committee, which is Misinformation, Disinformation, and Malinformation Committee. And malinformation is it's just material that's true but kind of politically wrong, right? Or inconvenient. And that could be something that promotes vaccine hesitancy, or we have the Supreme Court case now, Murphy v. Missouri, that's partly related to the Twitter files. And the plaintiffs, and three of the plaintiffs in that case, are doctors who had published true research about COVID, but were suppressed, were de-amplified. They were put on, in Twitter, they were put on trends blacklists because their research tended to go against federal policies about lockdowns and vaccination and all kinds of things. So to me, that's what the First Amendment is there for, right? Like, we do not want the government in a role of deciding what's true and untrue, because once you do that, the government has a monopoly on misinformation.
Right.
The only protection against that happening is absolutely unfettered free speech. And they're messing with that, because I think there's just this gradual moving away from belief that all the concepts in the Bill of Rights work. And so what we looked at in terms of the censorship, it's very much in evidence there, where they just don't believe that the First Amendment works, I don't think.
But they're the government. They exist to protect the First Amendment. That's the whole point of having a government, right? So again, that seems like a prima facie crime to me. And as you said, at very least, a huge story.
Right.
What happened to that story once you reported it?
I was denounced as a right-wing tool, right? The Washington Post, their first story about the Twitter files, described me as conservative journalist Matt Taibbi. And then they did a silent edit.
I would beg to differ.
Yeah. It was just ridiculous. And that was the line all the way through, even though the reports they weren't really about suppression of one political party or another. They were really much more about this process, which is just so scary, right? And nobody in the regular press really picked it up. And that was a shocker to me, because I thought, well, somebody's got to be interested in this, and they weren't,
How long were you there?
At Twitter doing the story, 3.5 months, I would say. So we got a lot of stuff. We got, not a lot, 200,000 emails, something like that, attachments. We still haven't gone through all of it. But the big thing was that there's just lots of evidence of this interplay between government and these platforms.
I think Elon at one point said publicly that there were Intel operatives working at Google, at Twitter, rather.
Lots of them.
Working there.
Lots of them. And that was another thing we didn't understand, when we first got there. We're like, why is there a CIA person here? Why is this person a former National Security Council operative? Like, what value add do they bring to
a tech company?
I couldn't understand that.
But they're actually working there as employees.
Yeah. And they were making a lot of the big decisions about content too. In fact, one of the biggest emails that we found there was a debate about whether or not Twitter had the ability to say no to, in this case, it was a State Department request about content. And the former CIA employee says, our window on that is closing as our government partners become more aggressive in their attributions, right? So what they were basically saying is, our ability to push back is evaporating, and that, I think, has turned out to be true with these platforms. I think they're increasingly just sort of intertwined with government, with the state. Yeah.
So state media.
Yeah. And this is another continuation of the war on terror thing, because they began by demanding that these companies fork over, information about geolocation of users and other places around the world, or even in the United States. But now they're venturing into content, right? Content domestically that people see.
So Google's the biggest, of course, of all these companies, and by far the most influential, as a monopoly on search, which is your window into all information.
Right.
If we were ever to see what goes on internally at Google, what do you think we would learn?
Well, I think we would find that they have massively changed the formula for, search returns. I mean, they even talked about this in 2017 and 2018 when they had this thing called Project Owl, which was designed to change the parameters of the search towards something they called authority. And authority was basically, the way it was explained to me when I talked to somebody at Google, it was like, if you search for baseball 5 years ago, you might have seen your local Little League team. Now you'll see MLB.com come up first, right? And, you've probably noticed this when you do a Google search. The first 40 or 50 results will all be of a certain type, and it's much, much harder to find kind of this counter narrative version of reality now. Even if you know exactly what you're looking for or type in the title of the story, it's made reporting harder, don't you think? I mean,
it's it actually challenges your understand, like, what is reality,
Right.
right? So, I mean, the potential for mind control, or in fact, the reality of mind control by the state and by affiliated actors, dependent on the state or living in a symbiotic relationship with the state, it's like it's almost impossible to have independent thoughts at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah. I mean, if most people are getting their information through these searches, and through social media exchanges, and those things are heavily, managed, then everybody's getting a skewed version of reality, and that's going to change the way that they think about everything. Um, I think that's really dangerous. Obviously, it's not a new concept because we all read about it and Orwell and Aldous Huxley and all these other books. But what happens to people when they're getting their information in a way that's completely inorganic and false? And I think we have to get to the bottom of that. I don't know. I think it's scary.
Do you think there's been any slackening of it? I mean, we're in the middle of an election season right now. Pretty clear that the people in charge in both parties will do anything to stop Trump, and for reasons probably nothing to do with Trump, actually, but bigger story. But whatever the cause, they're totally determined to control the outcome of this election.
Yeah. Well,
can you have a democracy under those circumstances?
I don't think so. So there was a Supreme Court case. There's one that's still going on, Murphy v. Missouri, and originally the lower courts ruled that the federal government can't be, doing that back and forth with all these platforms. And from what I understood, there was a little bit of a backing off point, right, where they weren't so intimately involved. But just about a month ago, Senator Mark Warner had a talk, and he said that essentially the companies have begun talking to the agencies again. This was after the Supreme Court held the hearing on that case, and it didn't look so good for the free speech advocates afterwards. So, that tells me that they're already, thinking of coming up with another program. I know for a fact, for stories that I'm working on, that there are a couple of different contracting ideas for new sort of content review programs that would be partnerships with government in the same way that there were the last time around. Like the last time around, we had this thing called the Election Integrity Partnership. It was run out of Stanford, but it was done in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security and the Global Engagement Center, which is at the State Department, and the University of Washington and some other partners. But that was a thing where there was a big organized content flagging operation that involved the government. They're going to do something like that again. It's just a question of like who's going to do it, what the method is going to be. And my understanding is that it's going to be more aggressive this time around.